Okay, so this is a week where I am very excited about, and this week we are going to talk about language, culture, and identity. So this particular topic I am very much interested in. I do a lot of research in this area of language identity and culture and the intersection of this. So far, until this week, we have been focusing more mainly on learner as an individual. Things like motivation, anxiety, if you guys remember. But now we are shifting somewhat of our focus toward this social and cultural context of language learning. So the key idea for today is that language is not just a system of grammar or vocabulary. It is deeply connected to culture, and through language, we express who we are, our identity. So if you can think about or reflect on what we have been covering so far, we initially started off with behaviorism and also this idea of cognitive development. And now we are moving towards the social, cultural part of language learning. So before we even start this our lecture, let's first do some sort of a discussion, start to understand what you think culture is and how the relationship that we find in this title, language, culture, and identity. So try to go over the question, what is culture? What is the relationship with language, culture? This very basic question, but very complex one indeed, with your partners. And after you do the discussion about 5 minutes, I will bring you guys back. Okay, so everyone's back. So let's talk about what you have so far talked about. So regarding culture, just to talk about the definition of culture, I think we could talk about them for hours because the reason is that culture is a very complex concept. Identity is another layer. Language is another one. That is why when we started to make connections amongst them, it's very it opens a jar of I would not necessarily call it worms, but I think a jar of a lot of discussion, I guess. So let's just talk about what you thought, any of the definition regarding cultural identity or language, or if you thought about how they are related, you can definitely share what you have or what your group has discussed so far. So anyone?
I
Yeah.
think that in our group, we kind of agreed that language is always tied to the culture. Like it cannot be considered outside of culture. Uh, yeah. But identity doesn't always have to be tied to the culture. Like, yeah.
I think I can kind of guess what you meant by them, but for the rest of the group, would you like to tell us a little bit more about, like, for example, like examples? What?
Okay, so yeah, I think that like one of the examples that uh Will, I'm sorry if I am mispronounced, gave in the group is that for identity, a person who speaks multiple languages or has mixed backgrounds, his identity does not consist only of one culture or not necessarily tied to one culture. So culture is just a part of the identity, but not uh, the definition of it. But for the culture, even if a person mm, let's say like is not really in touch with their national identity, even if we consider that case, the formulation of language itself, it already holds some cultural beliefs, even like some idioms or some like other common sayings, they already express some cultural beliefs and already shape a certain way of thinking. So language is always tied to the culture.
Yes, definitely. I think Canel gave a very excellent. I mean, I think your group has discussed so far related to the relationship first between language and culture, and it seems like I think a lot of us would tie or have an understanding that language and culture is very closely connected to one another. And some of the idiomatic expressions, for example, that like through the idiomatic expressions that we are exposed to, we unintentionally or indirectly get exposed to a lot of these beliefs. in how to behave or how to act or how to express your ideas, for examples. So if you look at a lot of the idiomatic expressions, these are not just expressions itself. Those carry a lot of underlying ideologies connected to how you should maintain relationships or how you should behave appropriately or how you should maintain your life in general. So as you just mentioned, language and culture seems to be very much interconnected. But no, when you described about culture, I thought it was very interesting how you said that, how you used the expression one culture. That made us question about how you see the scope of culture, right? Culture is often understood to be very difficult to define because the scope seems to be something that is too big, sometimes too small. A lot of the times we might just say that, oh, culture is a very big concept, right? Like, which is identical or which is at the same level as language, something very big. But at the same time, some people might say that let's say, the club that I belong to, the swimming club or the tennis club that I am part in, that's also a small culture, right? So then people start to question, then what is culture? So that is one of the reasons why it is very difficult to define what culture is. But when you describe one culture, it made me start to thinking about how we are going to also talk about something called communities of practice, something a little bit smaller, but also that can actually get bigger and smaller depending on the situation. So I thought you're onto something very interesting here. Good. Teo, did you solve your underwater problem or
Can you hear me?
now you're out of water?
Now I can breathe.
Yes. Okay, great.
So, I just take the glimpse of this question. So, what are the only thing that I caught in my eye was what is the relationship with language? So I discussed only about this point, but uh, I think okay. So the answer to this is that I think the culture is the thing which directly shapes the structure or some characteristics of language. And I came up with the idea that the Korean language could be a great example. So I don't know such things in English, but to explain briefly in Korean, there is two layers of Korean language, like 존댓말, 반말. And the first layer we usually use to some elderly people or somebody we should be extremely polite. And the second layer of this language we use to like our friends or someone that are much more younger than us. And if we use the second layer to the elderly people, then we can uh, be like, why are you being so impolite? Something like this. So I think there are two layers like this, and I thought about the origin, why this happened. So it may be not correct, but I thought that this would be the result of the Joseon dynasty thing. So in like 15th, 16th, 17th century, there are really big king and dynasty things in Korea, and they strictly emphasize the manner. You should be polite to the king, polite to the upper person, something like that. And I think, and actually, those dynasty things last for like 400, 500 years. I think such very strong cultural things, which also long lasted thing, heavily impacted the Korean language itself, too strong that it separated the language into two layers. And it have been used for nowadays. So I think this is a good example for the culture and language relationship. And this is my idea. Yes.
I think it's very interesting how you pointed to back to our history and looking at the roots of where this idea of honorifics might come from. And as you just mentioned, it is very closely tied to the social system, right? So it could result from the social system and let's say pointing to the direction, language might be the one that has influenced or strengthened that type of strict social system, but at the same time, it could be the social system which reinforces the language system, especially related to the use of honorifics, to be something very concrete. So I think it could be related to both. Teo, I think while you were talking, it seemed like your understanding was culture is influencing language. Some people might have a different idea that language is influencing culture. So we don't necessarily know which direction it always happens. It might be something that is mutual, that they mutually influence one another. Sometimes it could be so much that it seems almost identical, that they are one. Very interesting point, I think. Yes. And also the idea that honorifics, I think, that's, for example, pointing to languages that do not have honorifics. I think there we can find a lot of contrast between the culture, or not only culture, but pointing to identity of the users of the language. Good point. Very good point. Anything else? I think it seems like all of us somewhat agree on a level that language and culture seems to be intertwined, that they seem to be somewhat influencing one another, that we cannot necessarily separate them in explaining one or the other. But at the same time, then we go back to this idea of identity. So I think I was in, whose group was I? I think I was in Sumo's group when you guys were talking about identity construction. And I had a question in mind that you all have your mother tongue, right? Yes, right? Yeah, all have your mother tongue. Then try to think about it. Do you think you would be a completely different person if you had a different language as your mother tongue? So for example, you have, for some students, you have Korean as your mother tongue. In this case, do you think you would be a completely different person if you had Australian English as your mother tongue? Do you think yourself would be a different person?
Well, our team discussed about it, and we thought we could have a different, like, entirely different identity as what kind of mother tongue we have, because as we learned during the midterm exam season, we learned there can be different personalities. Like if I use Korean, I use the English, then I can have different personalities through that characteristics. So there can be identity-wise, there is a relationship between language and also culture. And furthermore, there is a concept such as identity confusion uh, to some children who use both languages. And the thing that that kind of concept exists means that there is actually a relationship between culture, identity, language. All of them are related, I thought.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, that it seems like our identity would definitely change depending on the language that you use sometimes. For example, going back to what Teo was talking about, if you come from a country where you use honorifics, it's not just using the language, but you get absorbed to the cultural nuances of when you are supposed to use honorifics for what reasons. Right? You use honorifics not just because the other person is older, but because you're showing some sort of respect, and you're learning the rules that are supposed to be not written, but that are understood in that climate. I think this is what happened long time ago. So when I first came back to Korea, and you're supposed to, so for a senior who is like at least like 1 year older than you, then you're supposed to use honorifics. But I thought the use of honorifics also pointed to this idea of distance, right? So I wanted to signal that I wanted to get close to you, to a person who was 1 year older than me. But so then I started not using honorifics, I used 반말. But the other person, it has to be on a consensus. Like the other person should also think that, oh, we are close enough for you to use 반말 to me. So that person might have thought that I was being rude, right? If you don't get an understanding that, oh, now we are both like on a relationship which is very close enough that we can use 반말 to one another. So it again, like you have to not only know the language, but you have to be aware of the rules regarding like what it signals. So it's not just simply using the language, but it's much more than that. I think in general, we also use when you meet somebody for the first time, like talking to a stranger, you naturally do not use 반말, but you use honorifics, even though you know the other person is younger than you. This is not just because it's like it's a rule, but it's also portrayal of who you are as a person. You want to be portrayed as somebody who is polite, and you want to be portrayed as somebody who's not rude to strangers. So therefore, we use these language strategically. So it all is somewhat connected. Like when you use a language to somebody, we make a certain decision on how to use the language. And by using the language, it also signals what kind of cultural background that you come from. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit more than that and talking about now about more systematically understanding culture. Let's look at some of the cultural parameters, which refers to the cultural dimensions. So these are some of the cultural parameters which can help us understand how cultures differ in communication styles. So the first one comes out as individualism versus collectivism. Oh, okay. So some cultures emphasize personal expression, right? So that is more considered to be connected to individualism, which is connected to this ideologies of utilitarianism. This goes back to the ideologies connected to them. Collectivism is the one that emphasizes group harmony. So a lot of you guys might immediately have in mind that individualism is connected to Western countries, while collectivism is mostly connected to the Asian countries. This goes back to, however, something the ideology called utilitarianism, where everyone has equal right, equal happiness. The collectivism has to do with mostly the Confucianism. I think Teo was touching on to that it is more focusing on the group harmony rather than the individual happiness. So, for example, in collectivistic culture, students might hesitate to speak to avoid standing out, right? You want to make sure that the group harmony is not disturbed and be very careful not to disturb it. So individualism, you can freely express your own ideas because you have the equal right to other people to speak and vocalize your thoughts. Another one that comes out in talking about cultural dimension is something called power distance. This refers to how much people accept hierarchy. Okay, in some cultures, students may not question teachers because they feel that it is somewhat inappropriate. So it again goes back to the power distance that people understand and to exist amongst people. So some people might think that there are power distance between an employer and employee, for example. Or some people might, in France, they might have a different understanding about power distance, and that might result in the occasions of riots, for example, or how people express their unsatisfaction, right? So that has to do with this idea of power distance. Uncertainty avoidance is another one where some learners prefer clear structure and correct answers, whilst others are comfortable with ambiguity, and that might also be related to culture. That a lot of the times, some cultures might just try to get the answers or try to get their own answers from what's around them, rather than directly asking or directly questioning what's going on. The gender role differentiation is another one. That there are these different other factors like time orientation, action focus, or space distance, tightness. All this might result from the cultural differences. Can you guys think about any experience that you have from your own own background, or have you read it somewhere else about any one of these?
I just have an idea of uncertainty avoidance. You know, even in one country, even in this South Korea, we have different dialects, right? 사투리. And Chungcheong, Chungcheongdo is famous of very uncertain pop-up.
Mm.
And even in Japan, I heard that Kyoto is known for that.
Very good. So yes, as you just mentioned, that regarding uncertainty avoidance, depending on the region within even one country, one might stand out or one might be more visible compared to other cultures. Regarding something, I mean, while you guys were like here, I don't know if you can understand space distance. I usually have an image with me. I think a lot of you may have already seen it, but in Finland, has anyone seen like a visual image of how people line up in a bus stop in Finland? That they put a lot of space in between. So I think that also points to our understanding of personal distance, like the space that we need to make sure that it is protected. Yes. So I think this understanding of space is something that is also different. I remember that this actually happened to me one time in Seoul. I was near Jongno and I was in the subway station and I was seated down. And this older lady who was across from me actually came over, and this is a long story, but she came over and she touched my coat in a way. So it's a long story, so I would not go into detail. But to me, that was a very surprising event. I was like, why are you suddenly touching me? Like, why are you coming across? And, like, that's my distance, like my space. Anyways, that was a very surprising event that happened to me. And I started thinking about the space distance that seems to be very different depending on where you are, even across generations too. I think people have different ideas. Long time ago in Korea, you might find that in a very crowded bus, you might find people, older people usually, they might take your bags if you're standing right next, and if they're seated down, they might take your bags for gesture. It's like a nice gesture that you seem to be having enough trouble standing and making balance. Then let me take off your burden just for a while. But for foreigners who have no idea, they might think that, why is this person taking my bag, right? So this kind of very interesting events usually happened a long time ago when people had different understanding of space distance as well. Okay, so try to think about your own examples, especially related to what we talk about now. So these differences sometimes lead to some of the simplified views of others. So let's talk about stereotype. So a stereotype is understood to be an overgeneralized and oversimplified view or caricature of a culture or individuals from that culture, often perceived through the lens of one's own cultural background. What do you think this means, this expression? When we use the expression overgeneralized, oversimplified, caricature, do you think these have positive connotations or not really? Not really, right? When it's over something, it means that it's too much. And stereotype, therefore, people often have a negative connotations connected to it. That stereotype usually reduces complex individuals into fixed categories. So if these people come from this area, they are going to be behaving this way. So we have these stereotypes that exist. So for example, if you go abroad, you might find that a lot of teachers would say that, oh, all Koreans are very good at math, right? So they have this understanding, like all Koreans are very hardworking students and all Americans are outspoken. We have these stereotypes that we find not only in our language classroom, but outside of the classrooms. But what we call stereotype is that even some of the positive stereotypes, things like, oh, all Koreans eat kimchi or like kimchi, or all Koreans are hardworking, they can be problematic because they ignore individual differences. Once you start to just group people and say that this is going to be the case for all individual, then that proposes another issue. So that is the idea of stereotype. But what do you think is the function of stereotype? When we talk about the consequences of stereotypes. Do you think having stereotypes is unavoidable, or do you think having stereotypes is always bad, or what do you think? Or when do you think stereotypes become dangerous?
I think stereotype has indeed it doesn't have only bad aspects or good aspects, but it depends on the context. But I think stereotypes has some good functions like uh the first thought that came up to my mind was like if I go to the foreign country that I have never been, and if I have some stereotypes like, what should I say? Like Italians are very kind and friendly, or something like that, then we can access to some cultural things or some humanistic things over those countries more easily, and we can behave more, like what should I say? Like we can behave in the way that is more acceptable in such cultural context, I think. So it gives us a brief summary of the overall cultural things, I think. So I think stereotype in that way serves a good function for us. Yes.
So I think what Taylor just mentioned was like a very mild level of stereotype would give us an entry point or a window into the culture that you go into for the first time. But I think what is emphasized in the understanding of overgeneralization is that you just have a very fixed understanding, saying that this is the way that they're going to be without any exception, right? But as Taylor just mentioned, especially in the cases where you are going into a new setting where you have no firsthand experience, then this idea of having at least some type of knowledge would help you get through. Or so I think it all again depends on the attitudes of the learners. Like when they experience some exceptional cases, they would break down the stereotype and acknowledge that, oh, I realized that I did have this stereotype, but this is not in fact true for all cases. So having that awareness being raised is actually the importance of cultural learning. Very good point. Okay, so now we are going to move a little bit more into this idea of language, thought, and culture. So when we talk about this framing of our conceptual universe, this slide introduces a very important idea that language helps us organize and interpret the world. That's what framing our conceptual universe means. Our universe is something that is very conceptual. What we mean by conceptual is we have a physical world that we live in, but a lot of the times our world itself is constructed or established by the words that we produce. So sometimes they might not physically exist right next to us. For example, in a lot of these discussion classes, I ask you to imagine, right? Imagine that you are in a setting or going back into time. A lot of these has to do with the conceptual world that we have in our brain at the current moment. So thinking it about in that way, we conceptualize the world around us through linguistic symbols that shape how people think, through words, phrases, and also other verbal associations. So through words and expressions, we frame our experiences. I think this would probably have happened to you already this morning. A lot of you might have been coming to class. If you're on the phone talking to your friend, for example, you might have easily expressed what you did, for example, last weekend, or what has happened to you, I don't know, in your dream last night. Or you might be able to describe what you have done. What we do by speaking about our experiences, you're not really experiencing it again, but you are conceptualizing, right? You're conceptualizing your world or the experiences that you have to another person. So a lot of the times we use these words to frame our experiences. For example, I was talking to you about the experience that I had in subway station, right? And this subway station experience, I am the only person who can remember what it has happened. but my memory itself is conceptualized through words now. It is not, I am not experiencing every single moment again, but I can go back into time, re-experience it through my words and memory. The same goes with the way that I told you the story. When I told you a lot of these private personal stories to you, then when I tell you the story, you might have in your mind, try to conceptualize it. Oh, so when I said subway station, you might have an image of a visualizing of a subway station. You might put me into a setting where I'm seated down. You might have an older lady across me. You know, when I tell you the stories, you would also conceptualize it. And the way that we do it, a lot of times, it's just words. I think a few weeks ago, I told you about this abstract concept of love, for example. We say, I love you, but we don't necessarily have this concrete, let's say, like a cup or something to say, this is love, right? But we use that expression to conceptualize the feelings that we have. And it goes with a lot of them, like not only love, but hate too, loathing. We have different level of hate, for example. We have different level of liking. All this is going to be experienced through our words and our language. So then, we have to start thinking about this relationship between language and thought, or language and mind in general. So we have two different claims, two different claims related to this idea of language and thought. One is called linguistic determinism. When you say the word determinate means very strong and rigid, right? So therefore, linguistic determinism is a very strong claim that says that language determines thought. So language is going to determine what you think, how you behave. So language determines, shapes the way one thinks, perceives, and feels within a speech community. The argument that language determinism suggests is that, for example, if you don't have love in your language, then you won't be able to feel love, right? Because you have the word love, you can start to make connection between how you feel to what love might be. Similar to the case of a lot of expressions like, for instance, 시원하다. Anel or Puricorn or Daniel or anyone else, did you guys learn about the expression called 시원하다? No, Daniel, not yet. 시원하다, when do you think we usually use the expression 시원하다? Anyone?
When ajaxis have their 국밥.
That was the example that I was going to go for. But, so 시원하다, I think the first definition that you find in the dictionary, it means cool, right? For example, the weather is becoming cool. Or today it's cool. 시원하다, 시원한 바람. So 바람 is like wind, so cool wind or refreshing wind, for instance. But as we just mentioned, 시원하다 also could be used for when, let's say, an older man, 아저씨, when they, or you guys too, when you have like a bad hangover, like drinking a lot, the next morning they go to eat like 국밥, which is like hot soup, and then they would say 시원하다. To me, I was like very confused as a child because that is very, very hot. It's like a really hot soup. But people drinking it or having it would say 시원하다. So there's this mismatch between, I think, what the hot soup was suggesting and the definition of cool. So I think overall, it has to do with this relief of stress or relief of the heavy drinking that they have done before, but that could be found in a lot of expressions. But without the word itself, people would not be able to describe what it actually feels like. I had another issue related to a Korean word, which was 속 쓰리다 too. It's like having this bitter feeling, I think. Like not stomach ache, but having this type of ache. People usually have this after having, again, a bad hangover. The thing is, I can't drink. So I don't drink and I can't drink. So I have never had that feeling of 속쓰리다. So to me, that's a word that people have, but I have never felt it. So to me, it's just a word. So that was very interesting when we start to make connection about how that word actually conceptualizes or what it actually provides us with the feelings and how we perceive the reality. So moving on to the next one is called the linguistic relativity. This is the weaker version. So the weaker version of linguistic relativity suggests that language influences one's cultural worldview and patterns of thought while also emphasizing the interaction between language and culture. So linguistic determinism was the one that came first, as you can naturally imagine. And then after hearing a lot of criticism, then there was a weaker claim, which was linguistic relativity. And these ideas, more specifically, were developed by somebody named Sapir and Whorf. I don't know if you've heard about this theory called Sapir-Whorf theory before. No? Sapir-Whorf theory is another one that we are going to soon talk about. So we have Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. As you can tell from the age difference, he was, I think he was the student of Sapir later on. So we see Edward Sapir here on the left, and we have Benjamin Whorf. These are two scholars who played a very key role in developing ideas about the relationship between language and thought. So Edward Sapir was a linguist and also anthropologist early in the 20th century. And he was interested in how language is connected to culture and how different societies organize their meanings through language. Benjamin Whorf was not originally trained as a linguist, I believe. And I think he was like a chemical engineer or something, but he became very interested in how language was produced, especially by this Native American languages, which is called Hopi. And this observation led to explore how the language structure was influencing how people thought and how their mind was constructed. So together, these two scholars, they started with this idea of Sapir-Whorf theory, or Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was the accurate expression, where they were not presenting this idea as a theory, but as a hypothesis. And what happened was that one of the well-known observation was that different language expressed time differently. And according to these theories, they were trying to say that the time was not in a linear way as it was in English, but it was something else. So they started to conceptualize time differently depending on the language that they used. So from this particular idea, we get to interpretation, which was the one that we just saw before, the strong one, the linguistic determinism, and the weaker one, linguistic relativity. So today, however, most researchers reject the strong language determinism, linguistic deterministic view, but rather accept that language can guide attention and influence how we interpret experience. So let's quickly just think about the why this was denied or why this was abandoned later on, the strong form. And I think that will somewhat tell us a lot about the language and culture relationship in more detail. So with your breakout rooms again, try to discuss the following three questions. Why is the strong form of Sapir-Whorf's hypothesis, the one that is linguistic determinism, considered unattainable? Moving on to the second one, can people think about concepts that they do not have words for? And third, how do translation and bilingualism challenge linguistic determinism? So translation and bilingualism was two of them that confronted how linguistic determinism was not justifiable in all cases. So try to think about how these could be the ways to deny linguistic determinism. So go back to your breakout rooms. I will send you guys back for about 3 minutes. Quickly talk about these 3 questions, and then I'll bring you guys back into the whole group discussion. Okay, so now everyone's back. So let's just quickly go over the answers that you gave for the following 3 questions. Anyone who wants to go first? No?
So for the first question, I think it was considered untenable because we can feel and we can have so we can basically think when we were young, so young that we cannot speak any language, but we have some memories and we can process some data like some sensible things or something like that. So I think this is the most strong offending the evidence for the first question. And for the second one, I think we can say something like, oh, that thing, what was it, that thing? We can say like this, and every friends that hear me say like that, they help to me describe or figure out what that thing was. So I think there are a lot of alternative ways we can describe some thing that we cannot come up with a word or we don't have any words for that. And for the second question, I think if this Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was true, then we cannot basically translate one language into another language because we cannot escape our thinking like structure, thinking things in the cage of the first language we cannot escape the cage that the first language had constructed in our mind. So I think regarding these things, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was considered untenable.
Wow, great. So you have nicely summarized and nicely answered all 3 questions. And going back to the first one, definitely the strong form of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is clearly false. And the reasons are somewhat connected to the second and the third questions. That first of all, as Tae just gave an answer to, if we don't have a particular word for a concept, we can always express the concept with a string of different words, right? So we can say, for example, the feeling that you have when you do something. For example, like, what does having butterflies mean? Having butterflies mean that when you go for, like, say, when you do a presentation, you might feel butterflies or feel a little bit of an anxiety, such and such. Or when you don't know what 눈치 means, then you can describe, 눈치 means that you usually have 눈치 or you don't have 눈치 in these cases, and these are people who have 눈치, and these are some of the behaviors when you do not have 눈치. So we can have these alternative ways to describe a word or a feeling or express the concept that we don't have the one exact word for. The third question, again, we can translate between languages, right? And we can always learn additional language. So that is the reason why that this strong form of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is clearly false. So those were some of the criticism that it received, and therefore linguistic relativity comes out later on, proposing a weaker version that, however, still there seems to be somewhat related, right? And I think we all would agree to a certain level or a certain degree that, it seems like Sapir-Whorf theory hypothesis still provide us with a lens into understanding that people have tried to make connection between how people use the language and how that influences the way that they think. And that was somewhat really something that we have already talked about when we were discussing the relationship between language and culture. Good point. Okay, so the final one that I just wanted to go into before we end today is this thing called communities of practice. That Anil, at the very beginning, when you talked about one culture, that this is where it reminded me of bringing that idea back into life here. So communities of practice refers to a group of people who share a common activity or goal. So they share this interest in a particular domain characterized by these three elements. One called mutual engagement, joint enterprise, and third, shared repertoire. So when you have mutual engagement, let's try to think about a tennis club in KAIST or swimming club in KAIST. Then you have an understanding that these learners or participants build collaborative relationships that bind them together as a social entity. So what that mutual engagement means that you might have certain ideas about that it's not always something that happens from one end to another. It means interaction amongst these members, that there are mutual interaction amongst the members. The joint enterprise points to the shared goals. So let's say the tennis club, you guys are going for a tournament or something, that you have a joint enterprise, that you have a joint goal, that you have something that you're going to build together as a community. The third one has to do with shared practice, shared practice or shared language, for example, that the community develops a set of commonly used resources. You have a certain ways of practicing and also ways of interacting. So in a certain, let's say last year I was on a sabbatical and I was working with this group of in a company, and they were all using, they were not using the typical 대리님 or 과장님, but they had their own culture of calling one another something 님. So they would say, oh, like 민경님, for example, oh, 상윤님, right? So they would all call one another adding 님. In this case, it goes back to their shared repertoire. Okay, so that's the idea that we can develop in the community of practice. So when you think about communities of practice, it is putting people into one group, a community that they have their own small culture within. So within them, the community of practice, they might have their own slangs. They might have what is supposed to be the right way of practicing, or what you're supposed to show by engagement. Let's say coming to a practice once a week, or attending a weekly something, a weekly session, or participating in a monthly something. So these all show a part of the communities of practice. So after the class, just try to think about which communities of practice am I involved in. You can go to church, for example, that's another community. You can go to after school, let's say you have a volunteering job, that's another one. KAIST as a whole could be also considered a community of practice as one. The country itself could be one, but within the one big culture, you might be able to find a small communities of practice. So if you want to, a lot of the times I ask my students to do different type of projects, but if you want to learn about other communities of practice that you're not familiar with, then you can get yourself immersed in another community that you have no idea of. Try to observe what kind of shared repertoire that they have. Looking at the engagement level, all this might in fact provide you with a deeper understanding of culture that they have in their community of practice. So in this class, I think we also have our own community of practice that we also share and also aim to get through our semester. So moving on to the final one, we have something related to community of practice. So as we have talked about audiolingual method, community language learning, a lot of these methods, situated language learning. Oh, why does it say learning? Oh, it should be situated learning. Situated learning refers to learning that occurs within communities of practice. And pedagogy here in this case is tailored to a specific group of learners within a particular social and contextual environment. You can imagine situated learning, meaning that learning happens within these social contexts. So you get yourself immersed in the social context and then learn the language. So when entering the new community, you get situated, and also you can imagine a lot of the immersion language learning context being situated. So you try to learn the language of that community more specifically. So next class, we are going to learn more about the process of when entering this type of new community, what we go through as learners. We go through a lot of adaptation, a lot of culture shock, a lot of identity crisis that we have so far been talking about. We are going to go more deeply into this acculturation process at this coming class. So for today, you can think about the communities of practice that you belong to, and also I think that's about it for today's class. And next class, we're going to move a little bit more related to a lot of different research and a lot of more connections to identity.